Last lecture we talked about the Vatican, and now what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the Sistine Chapel, which is actually a smaller chapel off to the side. And in order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about Michelangelo. And he's one of the Mutant Ninja Turtles, and he's also really like a weird, moody guy, especially the way that he's depicted by other people and how he's written about. There's a really wonderful book about him called The Agony and the Ecstasy by Irving Stone. It's it's a rat killer. I mean, it's a really thick book, but basically it's a wonderful book. And I bet if you started reading it, you would be so entranced with it that you would keep going and you'd want to keep reading it. It's really well written. So basically, a lot of my information about Michelangelo is based on this fictional biography about him, but a lot of it is also based on scholarly study that I've done about him. And he's a little of a bit of an enigma. And so if you look at the sculpture by de Volterra, he basically is describing or showing Michelangelo as this sort of dark, moody character. And you can see that one of the things about Michelangelo and his face is he's obviously been in a brawl and his nose was broken. And this actually happened to him. And it's been documented that he got into some argument with one of the other art students while they were doing some drawings, some copies, and the guy popped him in the nose. And the reason why I bring this up, more or less, is to kind of discuss the idea that Michelangelo is this guy who was a little socially inept. He was a little angry at some points. He had trouble playing well with others. And he was also this guy who was an interesting character. And what they would call this during the Renaissance was something called melancholia or melancholic. He was a moody or dark character who was, they used to say, born under Saturn, which he was Saturnine or Saturnine. He was very dark and moody. Even the way that he depicts himself, if you look at the fresco on the right-hand side, that's actually from the Last Judgment. And some people, some art historians have conjectured that the skin of St. Bartholomew that's hanging from his hand, which is kind of a weird thing anyway, but he's holding this knife up almost as if it's almost as if he's giving God a sort of rude gesture. And you see this skin bag that St. Bartholomew has in his arms, which is an indication of his martyrdom. And in the Last Judgment, he basically is depicted as someone, that's how he was flayed alive for being a good Christian. And if you look at the face on St. Bartholomew's skin that he's holding, it looks like Michelangelo's face. And so some scholars have said, hey, this is really a self-portrait and depicts Michelangelo the way that he felt he was, and might be related somewhat to Michelangelo's relationship to the Pope in Rome. Now, the reason why I bring this up is, especially in that book, The Agony and the Ecstasy, I guess you'd say that the theme that ran through it was Michelangelo's relationship to Pope Julius and to the other popes, and how he was made or instructed to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling when he called himself a sculptor. And so he actually at one point fled town and wanted to get away from this commission of working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and the Pope sent some soldiers after him to bring him back. Michelangelo's career actually begins in Florence, and he sculpts David, but then after he sculpted the David that we'll be studying a little bit more in depth later, he is called to Rome to work on the tomb for the Pope. And so he basically is brought to Rome, and he has this idea and this great sort of plan for what he's going to do with the papal tomb. And it has so many sculptures that I think one scholar figured it out, and it probably would have taken him 50 years by the way he was working and how long it took to sculpt each figure for him to finish this sculpture for for the tomb of Julius. And so basically, Julius sees this slow progress and sees how Michelangelo is working and takes him off the project, but not before Michelangelo has been working on one of, several of the sculptures, and actually they are still in Rome and you can look at them. And so let's take a look first at this famous sculpture that I think really depicts it. And it's really iconic for the Renaissance period. It really has a lot of great ideas behind it. So this is a sculpture of Moses, and you'll notice first of all that Moses is very muscular. So if we go into a description of this sculpture more or less from a formal point of view, you'll see first of all that this sculpture is sort of seated or half seated. It almost looks like he's about to rise and get up off of the chair. You see really deep drapery, and that the drapery around this sculpture defines the form underneath. He's got a heroic and muscular kind of body. The hair has a lot of undercutting and undersculpting in it that really brings it into high relief. The anatomy is extremely realistic and accurate, but it's also fairly idealized. There's these cool little things that he does. For instance, the hands. Moses's right hand is entwined with some drapery that's a sort of conceit. We call that sometimes a concetto, which just literally means he's showing how skillful he is and how he can intertwine fingers with drapery and make it look realistic. The legs have wet drapery style. He also has these two horns that are coming out of the top of his head, and we'll discuss that in terms of the iconography or symbolism in just a minute, because that's actually something that comes up in Romanesque and other works of art, and even in Byzantine manuscripts, you'll see sometimes Moses has horns. The pose itself is a sort of serpentine movement. I think that Michelangelo called this the serpentinata, which basically means a serpentine sort of movement. It's almost like a seated counterpoise or contrapposto, not to be confused with true contrapposto, which is a standing pose, but this is basically a sort of counterpoise where it looks like he's rising up and about to get out of that chair. And he's got the tablets underneath his arms. You're going to see that that pose is iconic or significant because it relates to other works of art that we're going to look at in just a minute. The last thing I want to point out in terms of the iconography, and this is what we'll get into the horns a little bit too, is that Moses has a long beard, and so that is actually a sort of nod to the classical idea that people who have beards are classical philosophers. Then we also see that Moses has a beautiful body and is extremely powerful and muscular. And the reason why this is probably depicted is that he's trying to show Moses literally in the sort of classical heroic mode that he is a powerful person who has kalos. He's both beautiful inside and outside, and that the physical form reflects what his role was in the Bible. The last thing that I should point out is that the horns of light that come out of the top of his head. Now, some of you may have heard of a sort of bigoted comment that Jews have horns, and remember that Moses is a Jewish patriarch from the Old Testament, and that literally comes from a mistranslation or a misinterpretation of the Bible. Now, there's this sort of game of telephone with the past, and I think that that is really important. And the game of telephone with the past is this. In the first versions of the Bible that were in Hebrew, and probably even in Aramaic, there was a passage that described when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the tablets, he had rays of light coming out of his head. So that's literally like an aura or a halo of light around him. Then when it was translated into the Greek, it went through some kind of weird mistranslation, which described it, I think the word was cairns or something like that, which described it as horns of light. And then it went through the Latin, where it was translated again, and the mistranslation that happened between the Hebrew and the Greek stuck, and it became horns of light coming out of his head. And since Moses is a Jew, sometimes bigots say, well, Jews have horns like the devil, but it's basically a reference to this early Bible passage. Now, I think that also talking about this as a series of schema and correction and seeing where Michelangelo got his inspiration from is really, really important. So on the left-hand side, we can actually see a sculpture by Hagisandros and Polydorus and Athenodorus of Rhodes called Olaquon and His Sons. And I won't go too much into the depth of what this depicts in terms of the iconography, but I think that the context is more important. Basically, in Rome, around 1500, it was excavated in 1506. Michelangelo was there and he saw this thing and he was like, wow, this is really a crazy good piece of sculpture. And he thought, hey, I'm going to use some of the ideas from this. And if you look at how the central figure of Laocoon is posed, and even the kids around him on either side, what you see literally is this sort of half-seated pose that Michelangelo kind of apes a little bit. And the torso itself and the musculature, and even the bearded head, are almost quotations in Michelangelo's representation of Moses. There's another sculpture that kind of does a similar kind of thing. So Michelangelo really believed in sort of aping or using the antique as the schema for his updated versions of sculpture. We don't know where this sculpture came from, and it's in the Vatican collection, and this is called the Belvedere Torso. But I think that what you could do, even more than the Olaquon group that we just looked at, Olaquon and His Sons, this sculpture is probably the sort of linchpin or the central hub for most of Michelangelo's work. And what I'm talking about is this was in the collection of the Vatican. He saw this thing. And if you see the torso and the legs, it doesn't have arms and it doesn't really have legs beyond basically the upper thigh. And it looks like almost all of Michelangelo's sculptures, what he does is he attaches different heads, different arms, and different legs to this sculpture, and he uses this as the model. It's kind of like this seated counterpoise, this sort of twisting and turning, almost like the figure's doing a crunch if you were going to the gym. And he uses this over and over and over again, and it was in the Vatican collection. And so he saw both the Laocoon group and he saw this Belvedere torso. And I think that these two things were probably one of the most heavily influencing works of art on his art for the rest of his life after he saw them around 1500. So this is where we move into talking about the Sistine Chapel and the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Now, if you recall from the last lecture, one of the things that I talked about was in 1500, Bramante, actually a little bit later, but Bramante was hired to renovate and tear down the old St. Peter's. I think that's absolutely insane. You're tearing down this building that's been there for more than 1,000 years. But basically, he's hired to tear down the building and revamp and redesign the building. And so Michelangelo is hired to sort of work on this as well. But during the renovation of it, there's this little chapel in the, right kind of to the right of the Vatican. That's the Sistine Chapel. That's named after Pope Sixtus. And the Sistine Chapel is the chapel that the Pope would have been used to deliver Mass at that point in time. And originally, the ceiling of it would have had, it was described as having a sort of coat of blue paint, and it had gold leaf stars on it. And above the roof of the Sistine Chapel was actually barracks for the Pope's private Swiss Guard, and so soldiers lived above the ceiling of this. And so it's not a very sturdy building in some ways. And above the vaults are actually a whole bunch of soldiers clomping around and living up there. And Michelangelo is hired by Julius to go in and decorate this, and he balked at it. He was like, "Hey, I'm a sculptor, not a painter." And Julius, who was actually the warlike pope, he's this guy who goes out and conquers a lot of territory, insists that he works on it. Michelangelo goes in and he starts working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling between 1508 and 1512. And the back wall, I want to point this out, he paints that in 1534. He comes back and works under a different pope. The ceiling is enormous, and you've probably heard some of the legends that he laid on his back and was painting this thing. He actually had scaffolding that he had kind of designed and had put up there, and he stood while he was working, and there are drawings of him working on the ceiling where he actually stood and arched his back and describes in some letters how the paint ran down his arms and into his eyes and stuff like that, because it's watercolor. It's not oil paint. It doesn't stay on the end of the brush. He also, you've probably heard some of the legends that he worked on it completely alone, and that's kind of half true. He goes in and he works on this ceiling, and he doesn't work and play well with others. So basically, he fires most of his assistants who are going to do most of the work in terms of the painting because he feels like they just don't understand what he wants, and he ends up having a couple of assistants who do the plastering for him because most of this is in buon fresco, although there's some debate about that. Some of it is fresco secco. So he goes in there and he only has a couple of assistants who are actually doing the plastering for him. And the majority of the ceiling, as far as I know, is painted primarily by his hand, which is kind of far out if you think about it, like how big the ceiling is, 133 by 43 feet. The ceiling is an interesting kind of division of ideas. I wanted to lay out the overall narrative and look at it in terms of that semiotic analysis or a structuralist analysis, basically how each one of the panels relates to one another. And so if you see down the center panel, you have these sort of biblical stories that are all from the Old Testament. And the central panel has flanking on either side, kind of like when we looked at Ghiberti's doors. You have these prophets and Sybils, and so if you don't understand what I'm talking about, you should go back and watch the lecture on Ghiberti. You have these prophets and Sybils who are basically announcing what's going on in the central panel, and they are kind of what you might think of as the narrators. It's kind of interesting because I think that one of the things that is has been documented that when Michelangelo was living with the Medici, there was this theologian philosopher, I think his name was Egidio da Viterbo, who worked with him, and he basically shared ideas. And one article by another woman named Esther Dotson, it was in the College Art Journal, I believe, discusses that Michelangelo designed the ceiling according to the ideas presented by St. Augustine. And what we're talking about, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you need to go back and watch my video on Masaccio, is that St. Augustine talked about a division in terms of how he saw the cosmos, the city of man, which is temporary and doesn't last very long, and the city of God, which goes on forever. So in order to understand the structure of the ceiling, first we need to take a look at where something called the rood screen is on the floor of the cathedral. This screen that runs across, actually, it's been moved, I think, since Michelangelo's time, but basically it's this screen that's about 2/3 of the way into the chapel. And the Pope and his sort of entourage would be on the other side of this screen, and they would be the clergy that would be able to watch the service that was going on. Whereas you and I would be on the other side of the screen if we were lucky enough to get admittance to the cathedral during the times where the Pope was serving Mass. And rood, I think, is spelled R-O-O-D, not R-U-D-E. That screen has a correspondence with the panels above it. So the rood screen, I think, was originally located right around the temptation and the expulsion on the floor of the cathedral. So I guess it's a little bit more than half. And you and I would be standing underneath the drunkenness of Noah, the flood, and the sacrifice of Noah. Okay, so that's where we would be standing on the other side. And then the Pope and all of his heavenly entourage would be standing underneath the creation of Eve, the creation of the waters, the creation of the planets, and the separation of light and darkness. And what some scholars have suggested, Esther Dotson suggested this in her article, is the idea that he is standing in the realm of the heaven and the unsinned, basically the pure people. And you and I get to stand after we were expelled from the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden, and that it's a sort of statement about how holy the Pope is and who we are. The overall structure of the ceiling and the narrative on the ceiling is kind of interesting. And this sort of portrayal of the narrative as a series of stories that are kind of blocked out also relates in some sort of formal way to what we're looking at. So the first thing that you have to know is that the more complex scenes on the far left-hand side were actually painted at the beginning when Michelangelo was working on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And initially, you see a lot more figures in it. And some of the things that I've come across in my studies are that's when he was actually working with other people. He had apprentices and people who were assisting him. And then when he kicked them all out, the figures become much less numerous. And so as you move across the ceiling from our left to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there are far less figures in the central panels of the ceiling. And it might be an indication of the fact that he needed to paint by himself and didn't want to handle as many figures as he moved across. Then the next thing that I want you to notice is the architectural structure that's painted in a trompe-l'oeil style, which means to fool the eye. And we've got this architecture that is actually all just painted architecture. It's not real stuff at all. It's all fake. It's all phony architecture. And he uses it as a way to sort of panel up each one of the stories and also panel up each one of the kinds of people who are surrounding it, the prophets and the Sybils. And so we'll take a look at some of these things in a little bit more depth in the next segment here. So this close-up, first of all, we kind of see God drifting along and he's separating the light from the darkness, and we can see the planets being put in and see the forms being placed in there. And so this is the creation. You see all these weird little nude figures, they look almost like sculptures that are in weird exercise poses at the four corners of each one of the main scenes. And then if you look on the left and right hand sides, you see these sort of figures that a lot of them have books. Some of them look kind of moody and they're reading or looking off in the distance, that kind of thing. Those figures are the prophets and Sybils. And then there are these little triangular sections that sometimes have the ancestors of Christ, and and beneath that are the lunettes. And then underneath that, when we studied Perugino, you saw these sculptures that are these paintings that looked like the popes. Here's the second half of the ceiling, and you see this depiction of God flying in and Adam receiving the spark of life. And we also see Eve coming out of the side of Adam, and because Eve was made out of the rib of Adam according to the Old Testament. So we're going to kind of focus a little bit more in on some of these things and study them a little bit more in depth now. This painting is probably the most famous one from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and I think that there are some really kind of cool ideas surrounding it, because Michelangelo was this guy who came up with a whole other vocabulary in addition to the things that we understood about humanism and Neoplatonism and references to classicism. So first, I guess we should describe this in terms of the formal kinds of things. The majority of this painting is done in buon fresco. There have been some indications that he might have put some glazes of other colors on top, but since then it's been renovated, and a Japanese film company got the rights to film it and photograph it in exchange for funding the renovation of the ceiling, and a lot of it has been cleaned off, and it seems very bright and very colorful since they cleaned off a lot of the incense and smoke that had built up over basically a couple of hundred years. On the left-hand side, we see this sort of languid figure of Adam who has his hand out, and God's fingertip is just about to meet Adam's fingertip. The musculature of Adam slightly recalls some of the figures that we saw from the Parthenon and Nicola Pisano's reclining figure of Mary, but it also makes reference to the classicism and the heroic proportions of figures from the earlier periods. However, what I do want you to notice is that the head is a little smaller and the body is a little bit larger and the torso is a little bit elongated in some ways. And that is part of what makes Michelangelo's style, that they're kind of almost like superheroes, the way he depicts Adam here. You see God the Father sort of flying in, and around him is this sort of weird drapery with all of these figures in it. God the Father has drapery that's semi-wet drapery that reveals the figure, but you don't get to see the genitals beneath it. And he also has heroic musculature. So the drawing on this, the sort of slight distortions of the anatomy and the over-exaggeration of the musculature is a way that Michelangelo transitions into saying something in terms of a symbolic or iconographic way. And what he's kind of saying is he's showing God as a philosopher king who has kalos, and the same thing with Adam. Transitioning into a more iconographic or symbolic reading, we can continue on to say that what we see here is the moment just before Adam receives the spark of life. He's sort of still languid and almost sleepy looking, and he has his finger out, and God the Father is flying in, and you see the moment just before the action takes place. He's actually not touching Adam's finger. It's the moment just before the two fingers meet. And some art historians see that as a precursor to the style that we'll be studying later called mannerism, in which the spark of life is being transmitted to Adam, and the action is just about to start, but there is no real action going on at that moment. The next thing we see is there's a little bit of a theory about who are all these creatures and things that are flying around and holding God the Father up. And some medical people have suggested that it looks like a cross-section of the human brain, with the sort of the medulla hanging off the back there, and some of the nerves hanging off. And I guess that's kind of reasonable, because Michelangelo did do dissections of the human body just like Leonardo did. But in any event, it's probably the Well of Souls at the very beginning of time, and all of these people are waiting to be born. I don't think that they're angels. I think that they're actually, it's supposed to be sort of all the unborn souls. We don't really know. Now, one of the things that seems like the most obvious thing is this is a Catholic church, and it has a bunch of naked people in it. And these sort of nude figures, some of us would be like, wow, that's really kind of in poor taste, because Christianity is sort of Platonic in its way. You're not supposed to look at these people as being, nude and physical and carnal. But remember that this ties in with humanism, that the idea that this is a rebirth of classical humanism. And so one of the things, I guess, would be a sort of nod to this is, you'll notice that the genitals are very much downplayed, and they're not very important in the ceiling, because basically what's really important is the heroic musculature of the figures. One of the things that I think is really neat about art history is sort of chasing or tracing the idea of the schema and the correction and updated versions of things. And so, for instance, this painting by Caravaggio, who is actually Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, which means he was named after Michelangelo, he is a painter who is borrowing from art history. In the first instance, what you can do is you could probably trace the sort of antecedents or precedents for this painting all the way back to Leonardo's Last Supper, because we have this sort of seated thing. And you could even go further back, because Masaccio has the tribute money, and the sort of finger pointing thing that's going on in this painting is very similar to the tribute money. And then if you go forward, it actually references directly Michelangelo's Adam receiving the spark of life from God, because what we see here is Jesus's hand is very similar to the hand of God reaching out to Adam and giving him the spark of life. And Caravaggio was specifically making reference to this. this has fascinated me so much that I've actually included the same kind of thing in some of my paintings. And so this painting called The Calling of Mark is a reference to that whole chain of art history for myself, where I do a kind of similar thing where I make a reference to Caravaggio and I also make a reference to Michelangelo. Not that I'm in the same league with any of these guys, but I thought it might be kind of cool to see or to show you an updated version of how art history can be used in contemporary painting. The figures that are surrounding the four corners of this fresco are referred to as the Annuiti, and the singular for this is Annuito, which is just basically Italian for nude figure, okay? And we've been kind of coming up with Erwin Panovsky quite a lot in this class because he's one of the giants of art history, and basically what he said was these nude figures were more or less angels without wings, and they are the athletes of God, and that their musculature represents them as being heroic figures, almost with that ideal of kalos, and representing them as heroes who are supporting the Christian faith. If you look at each one of these figures, it really kind of ties in a lot with that kind of idea that each one of them is a powerful, muscular figure that represents in some ways the power of God and his sort of angelic troop or angelic army. And so I think this kind of ties in a little bit with that. Now, one of the interesting little details that you'll see in most of the nudes' hands is that they have these baskets or these little bushels of acorns, and those are a reference to the Della Rovere family because that was in their family crest. The other thing that I want you to pay attention to is, remember we talked about the Belvedere Torso just a little bit earlier. Each one of these figures looks like the Belvedere Torso with a different head and different arms and legs sort of pasted on. So if you look closely and you can do a sort of comparison between the Belvedere Torso and one of these in Udo, you can actually see that it really kind of makes sense that maybe Michelangelo sort of was borrowing from the Olaquon group and from the Belvedere Torso in an effort to sort of show the sort of his understanding of the classical references. This is even kind of true in how he depicts the Sybils and the prophets around the margins of the ceiling as well. And so what we're seeing here is this female Delphic Sybil, and she's kind of got very muscular arms, and some people have basically accused Michelangelo of not being able to paint the female form and sculpt the female form, but all you have to do is look at his Pietà to know that he understood the female form and he drew and painted it, but he was basically painting them as being extremely powerful because to him that was a reference to the heroic qualities that a Sybil or a prophet should have. And as we mentioned in my lecture on Ghiberti, the Sybils that are referenced are pre-biblical, which means that they are from a time period that comes before the Christian Bible, during the sort of the golden age of Pericles, and that there are descriptions, and Dante does this as well and describes these people as sort of the people who are in purgatory that don't really deserve to be there, but they didn't know that Jesus was coming along and they would have foreseen that that was coming. And so what Michelangelo is kind of doing is showing you these Sybils who are announcing the coming of Jesus. And an interesting little element of this is that most of the Sybils and most of the prophets on the ceiling are usually holding a scroll or a book, and they are turning away from it as if they've just memorized a passage or they've just read something, and that they're going to announce it out of this book as if they're getting some sort of information from this and looking over the shoulders. The other interesting little component are these little putti, or these little babies that are sort of holding up the imaginary architecture that Michelangelo has constructed, almost like caryatids on the caryatid porch in Athens, and they are extremely muscular. They're almost like little people with fully grown musculature, but somehow they still kind of look like children or babies in some way. So this is the Delphic Sybil that represents that. The Libyan Sybil has a sort of similar thing going on. We can actually see this heroic musculature that refers to kalos. She has the book in front of her and she's turning back over her shoulder. And then we also have these heroic babies. Now, to refer back to the idea that we're talking about the female form, Michelangelo, even though this is a female Sybil, which is a female prophetess, he actually is referring to more or less female, he's making a female, but he refers to male models. And so we have some drawings of this. And the drawing studies for the Libyan Sybil are clearly made from a male figure, not a female figure. But one of the things about Michelangelo that I think is really significant and really kind of cool is look at these studies of the hands and how many times he drew the hands and what he was doing in studying the foreshortening of fingers and things like that. This guy really knew how to draw. And if you've ever drawn before, you've tried to draw the human figure, one of the hardest things to do is draw foreshortened things, which means things that are projecting out into the foreground or projecting back. And he really kind of nails it in terms of the big toes, the fingers, the thumbs. He is really interested in the veracity, the realism of drawing the human figure, but he also exaggerates it. And this often has been attributed to him as being the father of a style called mannerism that comes along really in the 1530s when he's working on the Last Judgment on the back wall. If we move down the walls a little bit, these are the ancestors of Christ. And so we have Jacob and Joseph, which are figures from the Old Testament. Kind of some weird stuff if you look at how they're looking at each other. It's kind of bizarre. But these are in the lunettes that are just underneath those sort of pendentive kinds of forms, those triangular forms. And they are the ancestors of Jesus. And then I think that he stopped painting on the ceiling, and other people had painted things just beneath where he had painted the lunettes. And what we have is this structure underneath the lunettes that show the ancestors of Christ are the bishops and the popes that run almost, again, like caryatids, that they are the pillars of the community that support the ceiling underneath Michelangelo's narrative that shows the Old and the Old Testament and some ideas behind the life and times of, well, I guess prefigurations that come with the birth of Jesus. Underneath that, we have Perugino's keys with Jesus presenting the keys to St. Peter. And so that's where we'll end our lecture.